more delicate issues.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. James, would you open us in prayer?
He just muted himself.
He was unmuted and then he became muted again. There he is.
After 8 months of Zoom life, you would think I would figure it all out. The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
Father, thank you for this time. I ask you to bless it, to bless our minds and our hearts as we listen. Let us learn what you would have us to learn. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Let me share my screen. And go to presentation view. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming back. This is probably a shorter class than the other one, and so we can pick up, as I said last week, we could pick up things if you want to carry on some of the conversation from last week. This is a class with a thesis, really, and that's that expressed in this caption: the Greek reason plus a Roman superstate is something pretty close to modernity. And I'm going to be defending that thesis through the class. Let's start with our timeline again. Beginning 600 BC, this is the birth of Christ roughly, and this is through to the present. As we said last week, the Greek philosophy, which is referred to as the age of the birth of reason, is in this window 2 to 600 BC. That Greek philosophy is still with us to this day. Universities picked it up in the roughly 12th century and have developed it ever since. Along came the Renaissance soon after, then the Enlightenment, then the Scientific Revolution. Now, modernity is roughly this 400 years here. I mean, there's different definitions of it, but I think that's the sort of core consensus definition, with it particularly picking up in intensity. That's what the color signifies in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And as you can see, it sort of stops there, and we refer maybe now to the very late 20th and 21st century as post-modernity, as we were saying last week. Now, what I'm going to say refers to modernity as it arrived in Israel.
Andrew, you muted yourself.
No, he didn't mute himself. I went to admit Jose, and you admitted him first, and then I swung and hit Andrew's button. So
Okay, now I'm now unmuted. Where did I get muted? Well, let me go back to modernity.
Post-modernity.
Because I guess Jose just joined us. The modernity we usually count roughly from this 400 years here, getting very much more intense in the late 18th, 19th century. And you can define several key features of modernity, and these are some of them. Now, I'm having the same difficulty now as I've had before, which, yeah, that's it. Yeah. You have the rise of nation states, and beyond that, superstates. You know, I'm having the same issue of advancing the screen. That's okay. Let me. This is an infrequent but well recognized Zoom glitch. I think I've got it fixed. You have the rise of nation states and superstates. You have within the state bureaucratization to run it, and you have increasing specialization of trades and activities. And that very much includes armies, including, that means a standing army. You have an international market economy. You have a state taking over or encroaching into the sphere of religion, either literally or metaphorically. And you have the rise of reason and its many fruits. So those are all features of modernity. As I said, I'm going to think about this from the perspective of first century Israel. And Hellenization, as we, Greek influence, as we saw last week, did begin about 300 BC. It was kept kind of in check, and then after that it grew and then faded with the arrival of the Romans. But it didn't actually stop with the arrival of the Romans, and it's hard to say exactly when these things did stop. But you can define when Roman influence began here, because they arrived with armies. That's the way the Romans usually did. And Hellenization was at its height. So this is from the perspective of first century Israel. And I would argue that time, the time of Christ and then St. Paul, had many of these features of modernity. And I'm going to defend that thesis and its implications for the rest of the class. So the idea flow is this, that Christ's time had much in common with modernity. And I'm going to illustrate that with a few passages from Scripture. I'm going to argue, not very controversially, that Jesus and Paul were tricultural, Jewish or Hebrew, Greek and Roman. So they were really at home in this ancient modernity that they lived in. They moved between the worlds, the Jewish world, the Greek world, and the Roman world. And then I think there's a couple of take-homes from this ancient modernity that we'll talk about. Okay, modernity then and now. Beginning with this feature of the rise of nation states and then superstates. Well, this is in purple the extent of Roman civilization in AD 70. It's not very different from its extent at the time of Christ. Down here, this is Israel. Here we have Egypt. You see they're all in purple. So is the southern half of Britain. So is all of Spain, the coast and regions of North Africa, most of the rest of southern Europe, and the Near East. You get the Holy Family moving after Jesus's birth between Israel and Egypt. So they're moving up and down this part of the Roman Empire. Sorry, the Roman Empire. You get Paul circulating, roughly speaking, in this area of it. And then finally, at the end of his life, going all the way to Rome at its center. So Rome and early Christianity are really closely intertwined. And just for comparison of a superstate, here's the Google Earth civilization as of last year. Now, Google Earth isn't a state, but I would argue that Google is a parastate, and it's just as it's even more extensive than the Roman Empire was. But the point is, culturally, it's spread everywhere. And there's nothing more modern, maybe, than Google. Bureaucratization and specialization, and I'm going to focus on armies because that's the biblically best attested kind and not the only kind of Roman bureaucratization and specialization. This is a map of the location of the Roman legions around 14 AD. So when Jesus was a young man, roughly speaking, a young adult. You can see there's 20 or so of them. And you can see that 4 of them are in this area, which was something of a trouble spot. kind of half blanked out here, you can see the 3 lost legions that the Romans took care of. All over this Roman Empire, you have the Roman military posted. And the New Testament is absolutely full of Roman officers and officials. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you of many of these, but I've snipped out some particularly prominent ones. In Matthew 8, you have the centurion and his servant, who memorably says, "For I too am a man under authority." In Matthew 27, you have the centurion at the cross who states that this truly was the Son of God. In John 18, you have a tribune, which is a higher rank than a centurion, present at the arrest of Jesus, overseeing it. In Acts 10, you have Cornelius, the centurion, and his family being converted. In Acts 18, you have the proconsul, which is a rank again, and that's an administrative rank, well above centurion, tribune. In Acts 21-23, you have the tribune Claudius Lysias. And of course, in Acts 27 and 8, you have the centurion Julius, who accompanied Paul on his journey to Rome. And these are only some of them. And all of those actually get what you could call good biblical press, or nearly all of them get good biblical press. So it's not as if there was a big opposition to these Roman officers and administrators. And just by comparison, that's where outside the US military bases in red and naval fleets are located today. So it's a very analogous situation that you have a worldwide, and this is the ancient world, this is the modern world, you have a worldwide presence. Very comparable. You had an international market economy. Of course, in those days, the world was mostly the Mediterranean, not solely, but it was centered on the Mediterranean, across and within which there was a huge maritime trade in grain, wine, oil, metals, other resources, other precious commodities. And in Acts, you have a really memorable description of a part of the grain trade, which is the Alexandrian grain ship. And a typical one, I understand, would be at least 120 feet long, 400 tons payload, and Acts states that this ship had 276 crew and passengers. Now, there were very extensive harbor facilities. This is the harbor, a reconstruction of the harbor at Caesarea, to where these boats came to dock. Actually, Paul didn't board the grain ship in Caesarea. He boarded it further west, but they did come to this port too. And what you may not know so much about is that there wasn't only a big trade in these commodities, there was also an industrial scale international book trade going in the 1st century. With Rome for Latin and Alexandria in Egypt for Greek. And there were what you could call small factories of copyists, and you could order a book from anywhere in the Roman world, place an order, get it copied, and it would come back by ship within some reasonable time. So this is sort of Amazon 1st century style. And you see evidence of this in Acts 19, where St. Paul triggers a massive book burning, actually a book burning of spells, and the account attributes the value of that at 50,000 silver coins, which is a huge amount. So that implies that there's a lot of valuable books around, and they do mean books probably. And to elaborate on that, in 2 Timothy, you have St. Paul asking, when you come, bring the books, especially the parchments. And when he was referring to parchment books, he was most likely referring to these parchment codexes, which are the modern book with leaves, not a scroll. And probably many of you know that Christianity were early adopters of the real book, the Codex, as opposed to the scroll, and they spread very much with that. And the alternative, the scroll, was much more unwieldy, but it was more common at the time. So you could order your book and it would come back copied within some reasonable time. So kind of making the modern equivalent. This is a B767 freighter version, a FedEx plane, only 53 miserable tons payload. Compare that with 400 of the Alexandrian grain ship. So you need 8 of these to carry what one of those could carry. And of course you have Amazon operations all around the world, not just in the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean essentially was the world to the Romans. So a lot of parallels. Now, you have then this trend for the state to encroach on the area of religion, or even to become it. In other words, literally the state becomes the religion. And the most central figure in that trend is Caesar Augustus, who's exactly overlapping with the early life of Christ. And to consolidate his power, he styled himself Imperator Kaiser Dei Filius, Commander Caesar, son of the deified one, or a bit more briefly, son of God. And the deified one in this case was Julius Caesar, who was his adoptive father. And this was a power move to consolidate his power by turning himself into really a divine being. And in the 1st century and onwards, you get the development of real emperor worship, the imperial cult that honored the emperor. And at least in the provinces, it honored the emperor during his reign. He didn't have to die first. And what you got in the imperial cult was shrines, altars, images, sacrifice, priests of the cult, processions and feasts, oaths of loyalty, hymns, poems, prayers, and coin inscriptions. And Father James was preaching on this recently, and this is just a coin of the kind that Jesus held up when he was saying, "Render unto Caesar, therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's." This is the head of Caesar, and the inscription on it is an abbreviated version of this one, Imperator Caesar DVF Filius Augustus IMP XXX. So he's basically saying Emperor Caesar Augustus, son of God, emperor for 20 years. So it's really explicit. And I just want you in passing to note this Augustan imperial cult temple from Nimes in France, which is one of the best preserved. And if you don't already recognize that building, or at least recognize a later version of it, you're going to see it later, but keep it in mind for now. An Augustan imperial cult temple. And of course, lesser rulers, far lower than Caesar, also aspired to divine status. And you get this in Acts 12, where I'm reading from the Message translation. On an appointed day, Herod, that was Agrippa, Herod Agrippa I, Herod dressed himself in royal clothing, sat on the throne and made a speech to them. The people shouted, "The voice of God and not of a man." Immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he didn't give God the glory. And you probably remember that it didn't end well for Herod Agrippa I. Let's look at modern versions of the state encroaching on or even becoming religion. And I'm going to show you 2 challenging pathological manifestations of this before we go to some more moderate ones. And I think this one is probably the most pathological that you could imagine. That's religious symbolism in the interests of state power, period. This one is much more recent. This is the People's Republic of China in a parade in 2019. It doesn't look so very different. In more moderate terms, when the state begins, in a sense, to turn into a religion, not as pathological as the last two we looked at, but what happens is that a gradual process of secularization, it co-opts religious, there's too many apostrophes in that religion, it co-opts religion's manifestations, its outworkings in educating people, in caring for their health, for their welfare, in justice and administration. And before too long, religion's role in this sort of societal infrastructure or societal mindsets, it's dispensed with altogether. And people then look to the state for a version of salvation. So the state occupies the space that religion has vacated. So then follows a kind of marginalization of religion, which moves into the private sphere and perhaps then is further suppressed, which we can talk about perhaps. So in summary, what happens is that religion's outworkings are retained in the state, but you lose the core on which society is built. And there's an interesting difference here between modern modernity and that ancient modernity in first century Israel, because then public emperor worship was as well as private religion. It was just an addition to the religious options that you had. It was a mandatory option, but it wasn't an exclusive one. Well, but now, or perhaps very soon, public state worship is going to be instead of any religion. So the ancient world was actually in better shape than we are in that respect, I think you can argue. And then you have in modernity then and now a rise of reason and its fruits. And one of the fruits of reason is law. And of course, Roman law is still the underpinning of quite a lot of continental law. And we have various branches like common statutory administrative law to this day, obviously. And so this is an example of a basilica, which would be where the Roman courts were operating. And here's the US Supreme Court, and you may recognize that as looking remarkably like the temple to the imperial cult in Nimes. You have engineering. That's one of the fruits of reason. And that's manifested in some really impressive mega projects then in the ancient world, and it's manifest in some really impressive engineering mega projects in the modern world. And here are two that look remarkably similar. This is the best preserved aqueduct, Roman aqueduct from the 1st century in Segovia in Spain. It's a magnificent structure, 2 tiers. Something that was pointed out to me only this week is that engineers very much use modularity as an operating principle. In other words, they repeat a module. They design something, get it right, and then repeat it over and over again. And you can see that an aqueduct like this is just a series of repeating double arches. So they're applying a basic principle of engineering with extreme skill. And this is the Chapel Railway Viaduct from Essex in the United Kingdom, which you see only one story, and I could have shown you many others, but I show you that one because it's a mid-19th century one that was done with brick. So it's not all that different in the way it's constructed. It's not a steel building or steel construction. It's built with brick, much as this was built with stone. And again, it's very elegant, very airy, very light, beautifully structured thing. Very strong parallels, obviously. Another example of reason and its fruits is, in those days, Greek logic, Greek math, Greek astronomy. And today we have maths, physics, chemistry, biology, other branches of science. And just in case we tend to think of Greek logic, math, and astronomy as being really rather qualitative and folkloric, just remember the Antikythera mechanism, which was dug up from the bottom of the Mediterranean, I think, dated at about 100 years before Christ. And this is a very sophisticated analog computer, a mechanical one, designed, we think, to calculate the positions of the planets and the stars. And a reconstruction of its internal mechanism shows it to be extremely complex with many gears and shafts. That's a thoroughly modern piece of mechanism, not really rivaled. Then, with regard to sort of societal attitudes, intellectuals saw religion as a sham. And in modernity, beginning quite early, intellectuals have seen faith as irrational, as something that should be basically discredited. There's this wonderful quote from Seneca, the Roman statesman and philosopher, that sums up that attitude from the ancient world. Religion is regarded by the common people as true, by the wise as false, and by the rulers as useful. And in a little more length, you have this quote from John Locke, who's an early Enlightenment figure, an early modern figure. It's written in 17th century English, so you have to sort of think about it a bit. But how well grounded and great soever the assurance of faith may be wherewith it is received, but faith it is still, not knowledge, persuasion and not certainty. This is the highest the nature of things will permit us to go in matters of revealed religion, which are therefore called matters of faith. A persuasion of our own minds, short of knowledge, is the result that determine us in such truth. So it's a persuasion of our own minds. And it's clear that he's very, well, I would say he's declaring it basically to be irrational, outside reason at least. And another step is that in ancient modernity, distractions became central to life. It was a kind of my pleasure principle. And today we have something different, but it's also centered on the individual, rampant individualism, I called it. And this is another famous quote from the Roman statesman, philosopher Juvenal. Already long ago, from when we sold our vote to no man, the people have abdicated our duties. For the people who once upon a time handed out military command, high civil office, legions, everything, now restrains itself and anxiously hopes for just two things: bread and circuses. Pleasure, not responsibility. And this is a short quote from Barack Obama, who is really here, I guess, decrying the excesses of rampant individualism, because he says, our individualism has always been bounded by a set of communal values, the glue upon which every healthy society depends. And he's really implying that glue is coming unstuck if individualism goes too far. Okay. So historically, Jesus and St. Paul lived in three cultures: the Hebrew or Jewish one, the Greek one, and the Roman one. So again, looking at our timeline, Hellenization there, Roman civilization arriving not long before Christ's birth. That's the period we're dealing with. They're both very prominent in ancient Israel. So you have the Hebrew or Jewish, you have the Greek and the Roman worlds overlapping, cultures overlapping. And here I'm doing something controversial. I'm ascribing on a percent basis just how much Jesus was in the Hebrew, Greek, and Roman world and how much Paul was in the Hebrew, Greek, and Roman world. And we can discuss this, and I'm very willing to give way on all of these. I'm attributing Paul to be pretty close to evenly distributed between the three worlds, actually. And I'll defend that in a minute. Jesus clearly much more in the Hebrew Jewish world, but also substantially in the Greek world. I've read credible opinions that he may even have preached in Greek, but it's pretty certain that he spoke Koine Greek, Common Greek. And then he was obviously also immersed in the Roman world, and I'll defend those in a minute. I don't think Jesus needs to have his Hebrew roots justified, but his influence of the Greek, I think there's a couple of clear ones. One is when he refers to the Pharisees as hypocrites, whichever language he used, whether it was Greek for that purpose or whether it was a rendering in Aramaic, the hypocrite, which is a mask wearer, it's a term from Greek theater. And there was a Greek theater in Sepphoris, not too far from where Jesus grew up. And it's not a concept that exists in Hebrew or Aramaic. So whether he used the word exactly that or not, he's using a concept imported from the Greek culture. Because theater wasn't part of Hebrew culture. And this is something that Father James pointed out, and this was his question. He says, this is Father James speaking, I wonder what we might make of Jesus adding all your mind to the Deuteronomic Shema. And that one is the one from the Old Testament, from Deuteronomy, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. And the one from the New Testament, for example, Matthew, is you're adding with all thy mind. And again, the Greek word there being used, and I'm not a New Testament Greek scholar, although I did study it a little bit once. It's dianoia, which is a Greek concept for the faculty of understanding, feeling, and desiring. So again, Jesus is adding, if not using that word, we don't know, he's using a Greek concept. And of course, Jesus used a number of Roman cultural facets in his preaching, and we've just covered one, the render unto Caesar, but referring to going a second mile in the Sermon on the Mount, that's also a reference to a Middle Eastern custom that the Romans retained, which is basically requisitioning somebody's labor to carry a Roman soldier's pack. So those are evidences of being really embedded in and then using in his preaching and teaching Roman culture. Going to St. Paul, well, he himself declares, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, so no question about his Hebrew credentials. His Greek credentials, well, the Areopagus Mars Hill address is just a wonderful example of Greek rhetoric. So he's using his Greek culture and, of course, the Greek language in Athens to defend as a kind of early Christian apologist. Although that apologetics may have been done in the form of a trial, basically, it wasn't maybe quite such a free assembly as I was once taught, but in any case, it was magnificent Greek rhetoric. And of course, he was a Roman citizen and at various points used Roman law to his advantage. So he really did live in those worlds, and he came from a very Romanized city, Tarsus. So what can we take home from what I'm calling ancient modernity? Well, the arrival of Hellenistic reason and influence in Israel was pretty soon followed by another feature of modernity, which is this Roman superstate that took on the characteristics of a religion very explicitly, as we've seen. And those first century Jewish people had good cause to respect both Hellenistic traditions and also the Roman state, but they had even better cause to commit wholeheartedly to neither of them. And you could say that Jesus and Paul were both really grounded in Jerusalem. They took what was useful from Athens and conformed to Rome where necessary. And I think you can say that we could use that as an example of navigating our own modernity or post-modernity, that, you know, we can be grounded in Jerusalem. And I've given you this quote, which is a Christian quote from Agatha Christie that I've always loved for a reason I can't quite understand. I nearly cry when I say it. But at one point in the novel, Hercule Poirot, the Catholic hero of Agatha Christie, says to a young woman, "Trust the train, for it is le bon Dieu, the good the God who drives it." And I take the train to be, at least in part, what we were talking about last week, which is our ability to reason, our ability to trust the facilities with which we reason, because it's the good God who drives it. We can keep reason on tap, but not on top. And some of you may know that's a quote out of context from Winston Churchill in World War II, who said scientists should be on tap, but not on top. He didn't want them running anything. He just wanted them as resources, which as a scientist, I find a little difficult. But anyway, it's a good way of thinking about it, that you use reason, but you don't let it rise absolutely to the supreme position. And you then give the state all the respect it's due, but you never make an idol of it. So I'm going to go back from there because that's one of my possible examples for discussion. That's really the end of my defense of the thesis that ancient modernity has a lot in common with modern modernity. And we can talk about that in various ways, not least maybe arguing with me about the three cultures of Christ and St. Paul. But there's also deeper issues here, and I do have one or two examples of that third one, the state respect but not making an idol of it. So that's me, that's my class as such finished. So let me escape from this. We can go back if necessary and stop sharing my screen and open it up for questions, comments.